These are the stories of people who broke through. Stories of the men and women who accomplished the impossible against the odds.
This video is brought to you by Patreon. Patreon. Like a rock. You know, it's easy to see what Nickelodeon did right and what Nickelodeon did wrong with 40 years of hindsight. We know what shows were popular, we know what advertising campaigns got attention, and we know what business decisions led the channel to success. We can put Cy Schneider's Nickelodeon side by side with Jerry Labor's Nickelodeon and show why the first failed and the second didn't. But you know, it's not so obvious when you're in the moment. A channel exclusively aimed at children was a new thing. Cable television was a new thing. And nobody knew exactly how to make it work yet. While he had never been head of a television station before, his pre-Nickelodeon career being entirely in advertising, Cy Schneider had looked at what models had been successful and built off those. Over here you have the television produced by Walt Disney, a mix of wholesome family entertainment and educational documentaries. Walt Disney coined the phrase edutainment, and Schneider would take that philosophy into his work on Nickelodeon. You can see Disney parallels in a lot of Nickelodeon's programs. Disney had their outdoor period piece adventure with Davy Crockett. Nickelodeon had their outdoor period piece adventure with Matt and Jenny. Disney had their science fiction property about children with psychic powers in the Witch Mountain films. Nickelodeon had their science fiction property about children with psychic powers in The Tomorrow People. And then there was PBS, the public broadcasting service, which had gained so much public goodwill over the last decade and a half with programs like Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And with their extended lineup of educational children's programming, they offered the nearest thing to a model for Nickelodeon to base themselves off of. And they were already heading in that direction when Schneider came on board. Pinwheel, still Nickelodeon's flagship program in 1982, has some very clear Sesame Street parallels, and Nickelodeon's original staff included a lot of alumni from the Electric Company. Schneider continued that trend by not just finding shows that were similar to things you'd see on PBS, like Dusty's Treehouse, but actual former PBS programs like Studio C and Vegetable Soup. Really, imagine yourself in 1980 with no knowledge of how Nickelodeon would eventually become successful, and you were trying to come up with a plan for that station. PBS plus Disney would hardly sound like the worst idea, and I would contend that it wasn't the worst idea. Nickelodeon was airing good, high-quality shows. Pinwheel, Dusty's Treehouse, Vegetable Soup, Livewire, The Adventures of Black Beauty, Spread Your Wings. These were good shows. In all of this, Schneider signed off on "You can't do that on television," which would eventually save the channel. In fact, I think it's wrong to say that it was the shows themselves that were the problem. But as the oral histories developed over the next 4 decades, one show in particular was pointed at as the reason Schneider's Nickelodeon failed. And that show was Against the Odds.
The world was becoming modern. Even by 1907, the most important ideas of the new century were already beginning to change the way people thought about their world and about themselves. In Switzerland, Albert Einstein was proving that some of the most basic ideas we had about nature were wrong. In the process, he would lead us into the atomic age. And in Paris, a young Spanish artist was insisting that some of our most basic ideas about art were wrong. Pablo Picasso was about to risk his career to create what we now call modern art. I'm Bill Bixby. Today we tell the stories of Picasso and Einstein and how they changed the course of history against the odds.
Running for 26 episodes, Against the Odds was a very basic little half-hour history program, at least at first glance. Episodes tended to have 2 subjects connected by a common theme. For example, an episode about Henry Morton Stanley's search for David Livingstone in Africa and the career and disappearance of Amelia Earhart are joined by the theme of adventures into the unknown. Another episode showed 2 Italian immigrant families in the 1920s and their divergent paths, one being the family of famous actor Rudolph Valentino and the other gangster Al Capone. A few episodes focused on one subject, but still kept things in 2 distinct acts. An episode on the space race had its first 10 minutes with the Mercury 7 astronauts, and the next 10 minutes on the Apollo 11 moon flight. The only exception to this format from the episodes I've been able to see was the one on Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, a subject that was due its full 26 minutes. They were so proud of this episode that they submitted it for a Peabody Award in 1982. The episode was not selected, but Nickelodeon as a whole did win that year for their programming, the first time an entire channel won a Peabody Award. The show was opened, closed, and acts were broken up by segments with actor Bill Bixby, best known for playing Dr. Banner in the Incredible Hulk television series.
Hi, I'm Bill Bixby. What is it that drives a few among us, the explorers and the adventurers, to go where no one else has gone before, to do what no one else has done? Stanley and Livingstone plunged deep into the uncharted jungles of Africa. They made many historic discoveries, but their most famous discovery of all was each other. Amelia Earhart ventured into the clouds at a time when most people believed a woman's place was in the home. She was in love with flying, and it was a fateful romance. Three people, ordinary in many ways, but driven to risk everything, even their lives, to triumph against the odds.
Filmed in Los Angeles, there wasn't much to these segments. Bixby didn't narrate the documentaries, he just offered a little flavor and a little bit of name brand recognition into the product. He was arguably the second quote-unquote famous person to be an on-screen talent for a Nickelodeon product, after Reggie Jackson. These segments are so simple with their black void and cardboard cutouts of historical figures that they're probably knocking out a dozen episodes worth of segments a day. But I would guess that Bill Bixby didn't mind the easy, no effort for him work because, well, Bixby was having a tragic couple of years. Bill Bixby's son, Christopher, died suddenly in 1981 at the age of 6 due to a childhood illness. Christopher's mother and Bixby's ex-wife, actress Brenda Bennett, fell into a depression after her son's death and committed suicide in April of 1982.
Even though they were divorced, even though there had been some hard feelings, actually was kind of the straw that pushed him over the brink. He was severely, severely, severely depressed.
One way that Bill handled it was by working really, really hard. But I think there had to be times when he was looking for some sort of solace and some sort of something to cushion the feelings that he had.
Bixby rarely discussed these tragedies, but if I was in his shoes and I had to be on a television show to pay the bills, yes, give me a low-effort program where I just read off a teleprompter in a dark room. The show had a rotating cast of narrators, many of whom had extensive careers. There was Philip Proctor, member of the Firesign Theater and voice actor, who later played Warren Vidic in the Assassin's Creed games, and Phil and Lil's dad on Rugrats.
In January 1961, Ham became the first American chimp in space. His successful mission paved the way for man.
Don't play coy with me. There isn't time. You're an assassin. And whether you realize it or not, you've got something that my employers want.
Betty, a thief? That's an absurd proposition!
You're an absurd proposition!
There was Andrei Stroika, who was the official voice of Owl in the Winnie the Pooh franchise between 1997 and 2007.
As a correspondent for Bennett's Herald, with the largest readership of any paper in the world, Stanley covered Europe and the Middle East. After 15 land battles, 3 naval bombardments, and 2 shipwrecks, he was about to embark on his greatest adventure.
Oh, how I envy you! Not everyone has the chance to face the unspeakable terrors of the great unknown.
And there was also Tony Award-winning actress Virginia Capers, letting us all know how awesome Bessie Smith was.
By 1937, the nation and Bessie were beginning to make a comeback. Business was picking up for the record industry. Bessie signed a new contract and was getting ready to record again. There was also the promise of another movie.
Hold on, little sprout, sitting there, reaching out, ain't no time to fall.
And many more certainly, but I've only been able to dig up 3.5 episodes of Against the Odds. The show never got a wide-scale home video release, though it does appear a few tapes were made for schools. I have found a few scattered library listings across the United States. Now, okay, you might be saying, is that it? I've seen plenty of documentaries on the History Channel and A&E or whatever that look exactly like this. Archival footage edited together, narrated over. There's thousands of programs like this. And you're not wrong. But the show felt a need to inject a little bit of wackiness, a little bit of weirdness, a dash of flashing colors and loud sounds in order to distinguish it as a children's show. It's the little things. The bonking sound effect from this footage of scientists assembling a satellite. The falsetto voice the narrator gives Amelia Earhart's mother.
Amelia liked to collect things, trains, cars, even wild animals.
Edwin, she's a girl!
She liked to build things out of wood.
This is not what little girls do!
The kissy noise showing how much Queen Victoria liked Henry Morton Stanley. The show's sound design had a lot of these little flourishes. In fact, this is the first show I've come across for Knacks that's mixed in stereo. But what really made Against the Odds stand out was its use of David Wild's animation. It wasn't complicated animation, usually a Terry Gilliam-esque cutout style, and often it looked very, very cheap. But it did keep things dynamic, especially for segments set before the invention of film, where you didn't have footage to edit in. Still images are okay, but the eye is drawn to movement, so we move things around a bit. All of this, the goofy sound design and the cheap animation, would culminate into bizarre moments like this.
He was there, a gray-haired, sickly man. The young reporter removed his hat. He stepped forward.
Dr. Livingston, I presume.
Well, that'll wake you up. The loud bombast, the flashing colors, the third arms drawn in crayon popping in and out of existence. It's probably worth pointing out that this show is David Wild's only IMDb credit. It's also worth pointing out that some episodes don't even have a credited editor, and instead post-production work was handed off to various companies, such as the Osmond Entertainment Center, a studio and production office in Orem, Utah, owned by the Osmond family, yes, Donny and Marie, so they could produce their own television specials.
Post-production is a very sophisticated art, so we are proud of our two edit bays. Edit 1 is equipped with 5 Sony BBH 1100A VTRs and a Grass Valley 300 switcher with 2-channel DVE. Edit 2 offers the combination of 4 1-inch or 4 BBU 800s for 3/4-inch online editing and 1 AVR 3 for 2-inch material. Both bays have Mach 1 computer editing systems and use an Ampex slow-mo system. Film transfers are done with a Rank Cintel Flying Spot Scanner film chain. Computer control of color correction is through Topsy.
Just a little treat for editing equipment hobbyists in the audience. So the quirkiness injected into the show does give it a unique flavor, but it doesn't seem like it was applied with skilled hands, and opts for a flashing lights and loud noises approach to keeping a child's attention, which is kind of cheap if you ask me. This does come into personal taste, but as a child who watched a ton of old History Channel documentaries, I would have been just as interested in Against the Odds without the corny pomp and circumstance. Yes, I will now go on record to say that Against the Odds, the mascot of Nickelodeon's Green Vegetable days, the whipping boy of the Cy Schneider era, Against the Odds is actually an okay show. Not a masterpiece, God no. It's a little too hyper, a little too cheap, but boring? Maybe to some people if you're just really not interested in history, but it's not nearly as dull as What Will They Think of Next? It's better realized than Studio C, and it's got more content than kids' rights. It was certainly seen enough and was evocative enough that people even sent in complaints. For example, some people weren't happy with the Valentino and Capone episode. Based on the show's publicity alone, we received reprimanding letters from Italian-American organizations. Copies of the letters were sent to every Italian-American politician in New York. The objections were that we dared to choose Al Capone as a subject. The same problem came up when we did a show comparing and contrasting Napoleon and Adolf Hitler as military dictators who had conquered Europe. The Anti-Defamation League was upset we were showing an episode about Hitler to children, despite the fact that he was characterized as a fanatic and a villain. I think this is interesting, and raises an important part in regards to all documentary media discussing history. For a lot of people, media like this is how they'll consume history, especially pre-internet. It's easier and less time-consuming than going down to the library and putting in the work yourself. But more people watch programs like this than make them, meaning you have a narrow point of view feeding a wide audience. And if that wide audience takes this narrow point of view as authoritative, as an objective truth, and then that narrow point of view is wrong, you've got a problem on your hands. Especially when it comes to matters of recent history, because then the narrow view is shaping how these things will be remembered in the long term. People like Valentino, Capone, and Hitler were still in living memory when these episodes went up. And some of the stuff against the odds talked about was super recent. The moon landing happened only 13 years before the show's premiere. There were probably young adults watching the show who could remember it. Martin Luther King's assassination was 14 years before the show, and the effects of the space race and the civil rights movement were still being worked out in 1982. Hell, they still are, and they still had massive aftershocks. Younger kids born after those events were still feeling these aftershocks, and a show like Against the Odds could provide them with the context they needed. And what you learn is what you teach the next generation, and then they teach that to the next generation. So even if you haven't seen the show, even if you don't know how fair and accurate it is, it's natural to be cautious and critical of how the show might approach these matters of history, especially racial history. So we turn our eyes towards the Martin Luther King episode, and we ask, is it accurate? Is it fair? What does it say about the man in the civil rights movement? What will children get out of it? Well, as far as I can tell, it's factually correct. It even discusses things that patriotic people in love with our founding fathers might find to be uncomfortable truths.
In the New World, conditions were no better. The Africans were thrown into a land with a strange language and even stranger customs. A land where even the greatest leaders owned slaves.
I love my slaves.
So do I.
The show jokes about how Washington and Jefferson were slave owners. It's a point of ridicule. That's not something you see very often, especially not in children's media. You don't see a single slave in Ben and Me. There is something to be said about using Dr. King as a lens of the civil rights movement as a whole, as his preaching of nonviolence and his undeniable charisma made him more well-liked among the white majority than, say, Malcolm X or the Black Panther Party. Speaking personally, when it came to the history classes in my school in backwoods Idaho, Martin Luther King was the only part of the civil rights movement we talked about. But on the flip side, you do have less than a half hour to work with, and the show doesn't shy away from the ugliness of history. Racial violence is brought up, the Ku Klux Klan are called out, and while things like racial slurs aren't presented, they do show us this image of a man in a Confederate flag shirt flipping the bird. Actually, they show people flipping the bird multiple times on this show. And most importantly, they don't do what a lot of documentaries do and pretend that Dr. King ended racism. There's so much media that acts like, now that the civil rights movement is over, racism is over, everything is solved. Against the Odds doesn't do that.
Hatred exists everywhere, and prejudice and violence. They happen on every page of history. Martin Luther King made his country face up to its hatreds, and he gave people a dream of something better, something worthy of a nation dedicated to freedom and equality. Oh, the hatred still exists, but so does the dream. I'm Bill Bixby. Thank you for joining me on Against the Odds.
It's a solid historical documentary. It uses its time well to speak the truth, and it lets us know that this is not the end of the story. Guys, really, Against the Odds is pretty good. So why does it have that stigma? Why is this the example of what Nickelodeon was doing wrong at the time? Well, I would theorize that part of the blame is the fact that this is the only show Cy Schneider himself created for the channel. Against the Odds is the only Nickelodeon show with his name in the credits. It's undeniable that Nickelodeon under Schneider's leadership was unsuccessful, so the show Schneider personally worked on would get a lot of that negative attention. But nobody bashed on Against the Odds quite like Schneider's replacement. For Geraldine Laybourne, Against the Odds became the symbol of everything wrong with Nickelodeon at the time.
We were one of the biggest perpetrators because we would announce in a loud voice watch Nickelodeon, it's really fun. And then they would watch something like Against the Odds, which were, as my son called it, a series of little tragedies, which were inspirational biographies of famous people. And they would say, that's not fun. What are they talking about? So the first rule we had was never say you're fun on the air. Just be it. You have to be it. Everything we do, it's more important that we are funny in our on-air promotion than we sell anything.
Now, I'm not accusing Laybourne of doing a hit job. Cy Schneider's Nickelodeon wasn't successful. But I don't think you can just point to Against the Odds and go, there's the reason why. Cy Schneider's failings came in 3 parts. Failure in management, failure in marketing, and failure in looking towards the future. By all accounts, Nickelodeon's small 20-person staff was highly compartmentalized and hierarchical, with people in different departments talking directly to Schneider, but none of them talking to each other. It just wasn't a team. As for marketing, while I personally like the Silver Ball logo, its use of pinball and balloon text presented an increasingly antiquated idea of fun, something that the channel struggled with from day one. And because the channel had little interest in discovering and developing new models of fun, it instead looked to past models. Disney television from the 50s, PBS a decade ago. You Can't Do That on Television was the most in tune with what kids in the early 80s were hungry for on television, and it still wouldn't have happened if Schneider couldn't have mentally connected it with a previously successful model. Oh, it's like Laugh-In. People loved Laugh-In 9 years ago. Schneider made plenty of good decisions, but he just had no eye towards the future. A history show was perfect for him because all he could think about was the past. Against the Odds is a B+ show at best, but it definitely doesn't deserve its reputation of everything Nickelodeon was doing wrong. It was wrong for Nickelodeon only with the hindsight of what was right for Nickelodeon, and nobody yet knew what was right for Nickelodeon. Its main problem wasn't the content itself, but that, well, you're filming a well-known actor like Bill Bixby in Los Angeles, then shipping the footage to Utah to be edited by a studio owned by Donny and Marie. Despite how cheap it looked, this show was not cost efficient. Maybe as a history show that lays narration over stills and archive footage with what some have said is an annoying sense of humor, maybe I'm just worried about throwing stones at my glass house here. But I was pleasantly surprised with Against the Odds. If not amazing television, it was solid history, and that's what's really important for a show like this.
Nick, 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 Nickelodeon. Nick, 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 Nickelodeon.
Next time, Nickelodeon goes to the movies, and Spock will be our tour guide. Today's shout out goes to Anytime Playdate, Inside the Preschool Entertainment Boom, or How Television Became My Baby's Best Friend by Dottie Hayes. This 2008 book is a pretty interesting examination of preschool television as a whole, and includes a section on Cy Schneider's time on Nickelodeon. There actually isn't a whole lot of new information here, but sometimes seeing old information framed in another context can be very enlightening. Thank you all for watching. If you'd like to support Knacks and the Pop Arena in general, perhaps consider contributing to my Patreon. The more money I make, the better the production quality, and ensures that I can pay my rent while focusing 100% on sending videos your way. You can also support the channel by subscribing, hitting that bell icon for notifications, liking the video, following me on Twitter, and sharing Knacks with all your friends. Until next time.